Thank you very much. I want to welcome all of you to the UC Student and Policy Center and to this very special talk by our colleague, Dr. Richard Kravitz. The subject he's going to talk to us about today, communications and misinformation, couldn't be more timely. It has never been more important for all of us, from academics to university staff to elected representatives and beyond, to be thinking about the ways to be discerning consumers of evidence and information. So we really thank you, Rich, for sharing your experience on this topic and your expertise with all of us. But before we turn to this talk, I want to say a few words about Rich's leadership over the years. Well, of course, we are all thrilled for you and for your colleagues at UC Davis Health that you're entering this new phase of your career later this year. His departure from UCCS will be a big change for the staff, for students, and for many others who've turned to Rich for his leadership and partnership here in the center for so many years now. Over his decade of service to the UC Center Sacramento, Rich has made invaluable contributions to the university's presence here in Sacramento, and we've become ever more aware of how important that is. He improved the UCCS student experience, expanded enrollment, and recruited a much more diverse student body. And through all of his efforts, UCCS has expanded its course offerings and built a much more active alumni network. So there's many things for us to thank him for. Rich has also shifted the way that the center shares UC research with lawmakers and policymakers, connecting state leaders with UC's vast supply of researchers, data, and information that they need to develop sound public policy. Rich, I hope you feel, as we all do, very proud of your remarkable track record of leadership. And in honor of your service and your contributions, I'm very pleased to share that starting this coming year, we will be announcing several new internships in your name that will be available to future UCCS students. And as they pursue their goals and dreams here in Sacramento, we're going to want you to meet with them, and we're going to want them to know exactly in whose name they are carrying on this important work. It's a way of creating a permanent tribute to you for your remarkable leadership of this institution. So we thank you, Rich, for your distinguished service, your leadership to the university, to UC faculty and students, to our state's leaders, and to the many partners and friends of the UC Center here in Sacramento. We want to wish you the very best of luck for this next phase. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tom McMurrow, the chair of the UC Center Sacramento Advisory Board, to say a few more wonderful things about you, Rich. Thank you.
Thank you, Provost Newman. We could all go on for 10 minutes with Rich's bio. I'm going to keep it very short for a reason. Richard went to undergrad at Stanford. He got his he went to medical school, is what I should say, at the UC San Francisco Medical Center, and he, at the same time, was at UCLA for a master's in public health. But it was all medicine. And his name comes up to run the UC Center. And everybody's saying, why is a doctor going to run the UC Center? And he not only changed it in the way Provost Newman highlighted, he also changed the way people thought about what he's going to talk about today. How do we make research relevant to politicians and who are thinking about now and a vote 10 minutes from now? And he's done it. And one way he's done it is through the CalSpec program, which it was his idea, and he pushed through the California State Policy Evidence Consortium. He and I butted heads a few times about this and never quite knew if we were putting certain people on the line and going to be criticized later by them, but we weren't. And he just rolled it out recently, and it went well, and that too will remain in his honor. With that, Dr. Richard Kravitz.
Well, thank you, Provost Newman. Thank you, Tom McMorrow, for the warm introduction. This, as you know, is my valedictory talk as director of UC Center Sacramento. It's actually also my first public address here as director. The last time I spoke in this fashion was when Bob Huckfelt was director, and I was asked to talk a bit about some research we'd done on direct-to-consumer advertising of prescription drugs. So it's been a while, and I have to admit some nervousness at doing this. But then I thought, what can they really do to me? Fire me? Then I felt better. So thank you for attending. Thank you for your support of UCCS. In case I lose you at any point, I'm going to give you the Cliff's Notes version of my talk. Now, if you're under 50, I've probably lost you already because you don't know what Cliff's Notes are. But if you don't, ask somebody who looks old. They'll tell you. Researchers and policymakers need to do some serious self-reflection. Researchers should continue to strive for rigor, but also for relevance, scientific synthesis, and humility. Policymakers should invite researchers to share what they know and insist that they put it in context. That's the whole story. Now for the commentary. We live in a period of mass confusion about many things, including the purpose of higher education. Are universities career academies or also training grounds for life? Are they centers for production of specialized knowledge or also hosts for rational and respectful public conversation? Are they ivory towers or also partners in advancing the public good, performing applied research that helps us solve society's problems and supports more effective, more efficient, and more just public policy? Working together to improve the production, communication, and use of evidence is particularly important in these times, an age of misinformation, where everyone's encouraged to do their own research and where election deniers, anti-vaxxers, and climate skeptics often occupy so much of our social space. In a way, it's my own personal attachment to the idea that evidence matters that led me to apply for the job of UC Center Sacramento director in the first place. As Tom alluded to, I spent most of my career as an academic general internist, seeing patients, supervising residents, and performing research focused on the social influences on medical practice. I had a little prior experience with the politics of medicine, and I'd run a health policy research center, but I was not exactly an obvious choice for the job. But for some reason, Susan Carlson and Ralph Hexter took a chance on me, and I'm really grateful that they did, not only because of the opportunity this has afforded me to occupy a really interesting and creative corner of undergraduate education, but also for building awareness of UC's potential to inform public policy. And finally, because of the many outstanding students, dedicated staff, and wonderful colleagues that I've had the pleasure of working with. Daniel Patrick Moynihan said famously, "Everyone's entitled to their own opinions, but not to their own facts." But we now find ourselves living in a world where basic facts, the safety of measles vaccine, the contribution of greenhouse gases to climate change, even the results of elections, believe it or not, are disputed. Whatever you call it, misinformation, disinformation, or alternative facts, these unsupported assertions might once have been found only in the remotest corners of the fringe press, the National Enquirer, the New York Sun. But now some very bizarre ideas can get circulated among millions in minutes. I'm going to use the term evidence to mean a collection of facts that support a conclusion. The conclusion might concern the likelihood of certain outcomes, the truth of a particular explanation or theory, or the benefits and costs of a law, regulation, or policy. To overcome the problem of alternative facts, we need actual facts. To surmount misinformation and disinformation, we need sound evidence. But here's the tricky part. We have to communicate that evidence clearly to a public that is prepared to listen and comprehend. And this begs the question, what is sound evidence? How can evidence best be communicated to policymakers and to voters? And how can all members of society be better prepared to evaluate the evidence that experts and charlatans alike put out? There are many kinds of evidence, each valid for a particular purpose. First impressions, formed at a glance, are often surprisingly accurate. Subjective truths, such as those derived from the lived experiences of people affected by social conditions, can provide a window into the world others inhabit. But my focus here is on quantitative, reproducible, generalizable evidence, the kind that forms the foundation of what we call science. This kind of evidence almost never arises from a single study. Sound evidence is cumulative. It accrues over time. This idea is formalized in Bayes' theorem, which might be the most important formula ever developed in decision science. Bayes' theorem tells us that what we know after reviewing the latest study is a function of what we knew before, plus what we learned from the study itself. If the existing body of research is strong and the new study is weak, we should borrow from strength and rely mostly on what we already knew. If our prior knowledge is weak and the new study is strong, well, then we should give more weight to the latest findings. Evaluating research quality is a non-trivial exercise, but here's 4 questions anyone can ask. Does the study design fit the research question? Are the measurements accurate? Are the data representative? Are the results reproducible? You might need outside experts to provide answers to some of these questions, but anyone can ask them, and more of us should. Too many studies fall short on these standards, often by virtue of being poorly conceived, poorly implemented, or misinterpreted. It's no wonder, perhaps, then, that Stanford researcher John Ioannidis, in probably one of the most highly cited papers in all of health and medicine, determined through modeling that most research findings are likely to be false. That's why when using research to answer a policy question, it's important to look at the whole research landscape, not just the peaks and valleys of individual studies. Again, evidence accrues over time. Today's answer will be different and hopefully closer to the truth than yesterday's. Systematic reviews and meta-analyses, which carefully gather and summarize all the evidence related to a given question, have rightfully taken up a place at the very apex of the evidence pyramid. The University of California has supported at least 2 efforts to inform state policy in this way. First, through the California Health Benefits Review Program, or CHBRP, and more recently as part of the California State Policy Evidence Consortium, or CalSPEC, which Tom mentioned. Sifting through the work of others isn't particularly exciting. It won't make you famous, and it won't get you above the fold in the New York Times. Or, to take a more contemporary example, it won't get you on Joe Rogan's podcast. But it's absolutely essential to understand what the evidence is really trying to say. Sometimes, though, the policy world can't work for the evidence to fully mature. CHBRP and CalSPEC run very fast relative to the usual academic pace, but still in some cases not fast enough. Sometimes you just need to act using the best evidence available. Making decisions under uncertainty is the bread and butter of public policy. Anyone wanting to communicate effectively in an age of misinformation needs to be able to say, here's what we know now. And when we know more, we'll tell you. Notice that little conditional. When we know more, we'll tell you. Contained within that conditional is a promise, the promise that we will know more eventually. The best way to guarantee that we'll eventually know more is to start collecting the data now. So how do we know when a policy isn't working as intended? Sometimes it's obvious. The ongoing housing shortage, the homelessness crisis, the boom and bust cycle of state revenue, these are big problems that current policy has failed to solve. In cases like these, you probably don't need a multi-year study to tell you that it's time for some new thinking. Far more often, policy impacts are subtle. To know what's really happening, you need to look carefully, using reliable data and sound analytic methods. Careful measurement and clear-eyed reporting of the effects of state policy is the only sure way to create the feedback loops that ensure that we keep getting better over time. That means funding rigorous evaluations alongside major public programs so that in 2, 5, or 7 years, we'll know with some confidence whether a policy worked or not. If those who don't learn from the past are condemned to repeat it, those who are interested in learning need to fund rigorous, contemporaneous policy research that provides the basis for doing better. In other words, go ahead and enact the policy based on what we know now, but please, please fund the evaluation. So let's now turn to the task of getting evidence into the hands of people who can use it. The research policy gap is the gap between what research tells us and what policymakers know and do. In my view, the gap arises from problems with the academic research enterprise itself, with the way research is transmitted, and with how policymakers and the public understand research. The current academic model tends to emphasize narrowly specialized scholarship and doesn't robustly support having a broad perspective on the issues or a deep understanding of the trade-offs inherent in policy choices. This understanding of trade-offs is what policymakers most desperately need and what many researchers are frightfully unprepared to offer. Researchers who want to communicate the policy implications of their work don't always know how to do it. There's an art to political communication. It's not enough to pile on the evidence. As UK-based scholars Paul Kearney and Catherine Oliver write, researchers systematically ignore the tendency of policymakers to base judgments on their well-established beliefs and to use shortcuts based on their emotions and familiarity with information. Indeed, it's hard for any of us to dislodge our well-established beliefs, and it's hard to resist mental shortcuts, like making judgments based on what happened recently or what we're most familiar with. In short, policymakers are human, and they often need to work fast, quickly integrating science, politics, personality, and emotions. Therefore, they're generally not that interested in hierarchies of evidence and other academic objects of devotion. They want to know the bottom line, know that they can trust it, and see how it fits in with their values and theories of governing. To close the research policy gap, research needs to communicate effectively. That means being credible, being clear, and being humble. Historically, universities have been regarded as uniquely credible, but according to a poll reported in the Chronicle of Higher Education, nearly half the country doubts whether higher ed contributes much to their state or community. This is a problem, and it won't be solved solely by issuing broadsheets about the multiplier effect universities have on state economies. To be trusted, you have to be trustworthy. For researchers, this means being transparent about their data and methods, putting their findings in context of other work, and clearly distinguishing fact from opinion. And because building trust isn't a one-off, it also means being available to work with policymakers over the long haul. So if you're a UC researcher doing work that might help solve some of California's problems, contact your legislators, get to know staff on relevant committees and within state agencies, and write op-eds in your local paper that you can then share with lawmakers and other policymakers. The second ingredient for communicating evidence more effectively is clarity. Overuse of jargon is the tip of the iceberg. The real problem, I think, is that our system of academic training favors depth over breadth. Doctoral students, and don't get me wrong, I love doctoral students, but their focus is often on producing original research on small, answerable questions that no one's addressed before. This prepares them very well to advance what Thomas Kuhn called the normal science of their field, but not necessarily for considering the human, environmental, and economic trade-offs attached to various policy alternatives in light of the evidence. In other words, graduate students are trained to be specialists, which of course we need very much, but we also need generalists. As David Epstein, the best-selling author of Range, writes, modern work demands knowledge transfer, the ability to apply knowledge to new situations and different domains. We're lucky in California to have programs like the California Council on Science and Technology, which trains newly minted PhDs to apply their broad understanding of science to the world of legislation. What they do is extremely valuable, but it's not enough. Clarity in the communication of evidence also means trying to make data come alive without distorting it. More often than not, this means telling a story. We know that stories are powerful, often more persuasive than data. The challenge for the researcher of integrity is to identify representative stories, stories that, as physician researcher John Steiner wrote, avoid sacrificing accuracy for rhetorical effects. Within these constraints, representative stories can engage narrative art as well as scientific accuracy to reunite general principles with individual experience. The third ingredient in successful scientific communication is humility. We don't talk much about this virtue or really any other in college classrooms these days. I think that's a shame because each of us is a human project capable of continuing self-improvement. What's the purpose of a college education, in part, if not to leave graduates with a little more wisdom, fairness, generosity, courage, and yes, humility than when they first arrived? These are what David Brooks calls the eulogy virtues, because in contrast to the resume virtues, like where you went to school, how many businesses you started, etc., these are the things people talk about when you're gone. Humility is a virtue that's embraced by many religious and secular traditions. It's a tricky concept because the minute you claim you're humble, that means you're probably not. But as New York Times opinion writer Peter Coy wrote in 2022, if by humility we mean listening to other people without presumption and being willing to learn from them, well, then that's a virtue worth pursuing. In the words of St. Augustine, we should really think it possible for another person to have something that is hidden from us. The lesson for researchers: be generous with your expertise, but don't pretend to have a special bead on the truth, particularly in areas that are far removed from your field of study. In other words, stay in your lane. Researchers as citizens can say anything they want within the law, but nothing does more harm to academic credibility than experts speaking as experts who stray into areas in which they have no special standing. For example, members of departments of anthropology, mathematics, performance art, and geology are not typically trained in the nuances of history, international affairs, or military strategy. They should feel free, of course, to examine the assumptions of experts and to speak out as individuals or as members of a concerned community. But they should be cautious about using their positions of influence to express opinions on complex societal problems or regional conflicts that they know relatively little about. Doing so only casts a shadow on the credibility of the academy as a whole, and in the long run, makes all of us who work here less effective. Okay, so let's imagine, optimistically, that we've got a credible source and a clear message delivered vividly through stories and with the requisite dose of humility. The message still needs to land. The intended recipients of the message, meaning policymakers and the public at large, need to be receptive. To properly weigh the evidence that researchers bring to them, people need to have a basic understanding of the policy issues at hand, familiarity with the scientific method, and enough facility with numbers to be able to make sense of the graphs and numeric figures that they're presented with. Most people will have a hard time with this. We humans evolved to navigate the savannah, avoid predators, and cooperate in hunts, but not to evaluate probabilities. We're stuck with the cognitive hardware we have, but we can still upgrade the software, making it possible for citizens and future policymakers to participate in critical analysis of evidence. How to move in this direction? Well, let's call three complementary approaches: the osmotic, the didactic, and the organic. Osmosis is the process where a fluid moves across a membrane from one compartment into another. If the two compartments are not closely adjoined, osmosis won't happen. Researchers and policymakers occupy different compartments. They need to connect. This will help researchers do more interesting, timely, and policy-relevant research as they co-develop projects with the policy community. And it will allow policymakers to develop greater familiarity with the way researchers think about their subject matter. In the didactic approach, researchers can join with policymakers, journalists, and ordinary citizens to create educational programs that provide a basic introduction to the critical appraisal of evidence. This should start early. In the American Democracy Project's Digital Polarization Initiative, college students are taught to read beyond the assignment, that is, to use lateral reading, to fact-check claims they read in the press and on the internet, identify the original source, and learn something about the individual or organization making the claims. Since journalists are frequently intermediaries between scientists and the public, anything we can do to upgrade their software will benefit all of us. In Washington, D.C., Dartmouth researchers have worked with NIH to create an annual training for science and health journalists on how to evaluate health claims. You know, claims like intermittent fasting will help you live longer, which is dubious, or measles vaccine causes autism, which is false. In California, we have lots of organizational support for research translation through the Legislative Analyst's Office, the Senate Office of Research, the California Research Bureau, PPIC, CCST, and one more acronym, UCCS. What's lacking are efforts to integrate the work of these excellent groups to incentivize collaboration, discourage duplication of effort, and promote synthesis of results. The organic approach involves creating opportunities for ordinary people, folks with jobs and families and other responsibilities and interests, to become more familiar with the tools of critical appraisal so they're more prepared to recognize false claims when they hear them. Here we're up against really strong headwinds because an impressive body of research confirms the power of motivated reasoning, where people shape their interpretation of facts to fit their pre-existing opinions. To counteract these tendencies will take an equally strong counterforce. One approach is so-called citizen science, which means facilitating experiential learning in the scientific method and critical analysis of information. Well, this is exactly what the coursework at UCCS is designed to do. We take undergraduate students with relatively little research experience and help them conduct individual policy research projects that address a problem faced by their community or state. The purpose isn't to produce future researchers. It's to acquaint students with the importance of asking good questions, seeking out reliable data, and drawing only those conclusions that are supported by their analysis. This in turn helps them to appreciate the challenges of producing sound evidence and to become more critical consumers of research claims. It's with this citizen science idea in mind that as a health researcher, I became interested in personalized so-called N of 1 trials. These are controlled experiments where an individual switches back and forth between several treatments in an assigned sequence over time. And at the end of the trial, they look at their own data and make decisions about which health practices to adopt over the long term. Aside from the potential to help individuals discover what works for them, I'm excited about this approach because there's really no better example of experiential learning for adults. Because with expert help, participants in N of 1 trials design their own studies, they collect their own data, and they interpret and act on their own results. Our experience is that participants not only learn something about themselves, they also learn about the strengths and limitations of scientific experiments. In the long run, we hope this will contribute to better informed citizens for whom the scientific method has truly been integrated. If we've not managed to stamp out misinformation, and we haven't, it would sure be satisfying if we could pin the blame on a few malign actors. But once you start listing the many ways information can go off the rails, from source to message to messenger to target audience, you begin having trouble proving ill intent. Most of the problems are structural. The COVID-19 pandemic supplies many examples. Here's one. At the outset of the pandemic, the Center for Disease Control recommended against mask wearing, not because there was much evidence one way or the other, but because hospitals were running out of masks. Later, the CDC endorsed mask mandates, first emphasizing cloth masks because of their ready availability, and later surgical masks. This confused people. As the pandemic wore on, these mandates were lifted, even in healthcare facilities and large indoor public settings where they might arguably be helpful. This confused the public even more. Meanwhile, there appeared on the scene a 2020 Cochrane review, which was updated in 2023, on the value of face masks for interrupting the spread of respiratory viruses. The review found inconclusive evidence that masks reduce transmission in the community. But this isn't the same as masks don't work. That's how the study was widely interpreted. The Cochrane review actually reported on whether interventions to promote mask wearing, such as education or mandates, help to slow the spread of viruses. Part of the reason for the inconclusive results is that adherence to mask wearing was highly variable, with many in the control group choosing to wear masks and many in the intervention group choosing not to. So in this context, it's not surprising that masks didn't stop transmission. That's a far cry from the simple statement that masks don't work. The way science advances is to layer what we learn from a new study on top of what we know from prior studies, from well-established theories, and from common sense. We know from good laboratory experiments that high-quality masks like N95 and KN94, worn properly, reduce transmission of particles through the air. Many questions could follow. Do high-quality masks reduce inhalation of viruses enough to prevent infection among mask wearers? Are people actually capable of wearing masks for long periods of time in public? Do masks lower inhaled viral loads sufficiently to decrease disease severity even among those who do become infected? The Cochrane study was not designed to answer any of these questions, let alone the policy question of whether government should mandate mask wearing under certain circumstances. Claiming that masks don't work is not only false, but also potentially dangerous to vulnerable communities and individuals for whom masks might deliver benefit at little cost. So, in summary, the research policy gap is wide because of how research is done, how it's communicated, and how it's understood by the public and by policymakers. What can we do here in California to begin to narrow the research policy gap? So here's 12 ideas. Number one, reform graduate school education to include Bayesian thinking, evidence synthesis, and science communication. If researchers want to help policymakers make better decisions, they need to be better able to communicate the state of the science, not just the results of their latest study. Two, experiment with new formats for scientific reporting. The onus here falls mostly on medical journals and their editors, as well as other scientific journals. Authors should be required to demonstrate how what they have learned fits into what is already known. Three, create and maintain better data for policymakers. The importance of data often gets overlooked, perhaps unsurprisingly, because data can be boring. But without good data, it's really hard to tell what's going on. In the long run, we'd all be better off if the state made further investments in comprehensive data sets and funded well-designed evaluations to accompany new policies. Four, encourage applied research and engage scholarship by hiring more scholars who are committed to do this kind of work and rewarding them for doing it. Researchers, by necessity, have to be focused, and they tend to hire people who are a lot like them. UC has made great strides in increasing faculty diversity in some ways, but not in others. A great public university like the University of California should lead in publicly engaged research. Five, remind researchers that their job is to tell policymakers what the evidence says, not what policymakers should do. The temptation to extrapolate from research findings to policy recommendations is great. So here's a trick policymakers can adopt to help researchers do what they do best. Don't ask, what are your policy recommendations? Ask instead, what does the evidence tell us? Not, do your findings support my bill, but rather, what are the likely social, health, and economic consequences of this policy relative to the alternatives? Six, Encourage scholars to stay in their lane and not speak out as experts on things they're not expert on. Doing so only diminishes their credibility as researchers. Faculty are free to speak out on whatever they like, but their opinions in areas outside of their specialty shouldn't be given any more weight than anyone else's. 7, discourage hype by creating standardized reporting formats for press releases and policy briefs. The human drive for self-promotion and institutional promotion is just too powerful to resist if there are no formal guardrails. 8, take advantage of new tools for disseminating policy research, including infographics, videos, podcasts, and short takes. This is happening already, but industry is way ahead of the academy, and we need to catch up. 9, establish formal structures to facilitate regular interaction between university researchers and public policymakers, and encourage informal collaborations between researchers and policymakers in both the legislative and executive branches. Zoom's good, but coffee is better. I'm hopeful that under the incoming leadership at UCCS, you'll see more and more of this happening in this building, in the Capitol building, and everywhere in between. 10, create high-value trainings and materials in evidence appraisal for members of the media, policymakers, and their staff. The Dartmouth Project and the Bill Background Request Form created by the Assembly Education Committee are two great examples. 11, take scientific literacy seriously from elementary school on. Most Americans don't know science, and many don't trust it. We need less emphasis on facts, more on process and method. As a state, we should invest in science education and science museums, in exposure to the natural world. And for its part, UC should probably address the fact that most STEM majors generally know a lot more about the social sciences and humanities than social science and humanities majors know about STEM. And finally, engage citizen scientists by encouraging collection and cultivation of their own data through groups like Quantified Self and processes like N-of-1 trials. Some of these suggestions can be implemented quickly, whereas others will require institutional and cultural change over generations. But as someone said about planting a tree in your backyard, the best time to have done it was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. Before closing, a few words of appreciation to those who've made my time at the center so productive and fulfilling, because everything that's been accomplished here has truly been a team effort and the work of many, many people. So to President Drake and former President Napolitano for sharing the vision of an ever more vibrant UC presence in the Capitol and for putting in place the resources to do it. To Regents Lieb and Riley, former Regent Kiefer, and the whole Board of Regents for their commitment to UC and UCCS students and for leading a private fundraising campaign that will help to secure those students' futures. To UCOP Provost Brown and Newman, to UC Davis Chancellor May, and UC Davis Provost Hexter and Krogan for their unceasing support of this program even when it got difficult. To Carl Moore, Jason Stewart, Susan Carlson, and Doug Haynes for being exceedingly generous with their good counsel. To UCCS Board Chair Tom McMorrow and the entire UCCS Board of Advisors, especially Steve Arditi. And to UCCS Faculty Council Chair Janet Kaufman and the entire UCCS Faculty Council for their wise advice, sometimes taken, but always, always appreciated. Thank you. To my family, especially Helena, my wife of 36 years, who has helped to soften some of my rougher edges. Any remaining serrations are my responsibility, not hers. And to my 3 sons, David, Aaron, and Joshua, who is joining us by Zoom from New York. David and Aaron flew up from Los Angeles. Thank you for being here. And also for forgiving me for my shortcomings as a father. And finally, to center staff, both administrative and academic, for joining me in a decades-long quest to expand student enrollment, enrich the student experience, and share knowledge to promote better, more evidence-based public policy making here in California. So many thanks to Brooke Miller-Jacobs, Sue Lowe, Alejandra Hernandez, Michael Hicks. I'm not finding all of you, but I know you're all up there. Graduate students, Paige Peloton and Alice Malmberg, professors Ross Butters and Jordan Quila, former director Bob Huckfeld and former associate director A.G. Block, and especially to UCCS Associate Director Cindy Simmons, who has truly put her heart and soul into making this the best possible place it could be for students and for the dissemination of evidence in the interest of public policy, along with managing the very complicated procedures attendant to this new building. There are, of course, many others who've contributed to UCCS in ways large and small, and to all of you, thank you for being part of this special community. But getting back to the take-home message, policymakers need researchers to help them make wise decisions. Researchers need policymakers to keep their work relevant. They really should spend more time together. One last thing. I have a little bit of a hidden agenda, which in medicine we sometimes call hand on the doorknob moments. That's when you've spent a half hour with the patient discussing digestive issues and they say, oh, by the way, doctor, I've been having this really bad chest pain for a week. Do you think it might be serious? My reveal is that this talk is not just for researchers and policymakers. It's for students too, because critical thinking, self-reflection, and self-improvement, what many educators now call a growth mindset, are aspects of living a good life. These habits of mind don't come naturally. They need to be nurtured and cultivated. They take effort. One of the most important obligations of university faculty is to help students develop themselves in this way. And one of the most important obligations of students is to let us help you. I'm optimistic that UC Center Sacramento, in its new home and with new leadership soon to be announced, will continue to do its part in new and exciting ways. And I look forward to watching that development from a distance. Thank you very much.
So, thank you so much, Dr. Kravitz, for that fantastic talk. And so we do have some remarks from our faculty council chair, Dr. Janet Kaufman with UC San Francisco. So, on behalf of University of California Center Sacramento's Faculty Council, which is composed of representatives from each of the University of California's 10 campuses, I would like to thank Dr. Kravitz for over 10 years of outstanding service as director of UCCS. I've had the honor of serving on the Faculty Council since its formation and was appointed chair by Dr. Kravitz in 2020. Dr. Kravitz is a phenomenal leader who had a great vision for what UCCS could be and who has shepherded it through challenges both great and small. The building in which you all are in today is a testament to his ability to collaborate effectively with the UC senior leadership, the Regents, and UCCS's advisory board to create a new home for the center that both welcomes students, faculty, and staff from across UC to Sacramento and provides a state-of-the-art venue for engaging with policymakers. During the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, he worked closely with UCCS staff to pivot the undergraduate program from an in-person to an online experience. He also led the development of the Presidential Graduate Opportunities for Leadership Development, or GOLD Fellowship, and other opportunities for graduate students. Additionally, he launched the California State Policy Evidence Consortium, an excellent model for sustained collaboration between UC researchers and state legislators to develop evidence that can inform policy. Dr. Kravitz has been a great mentor and role model for me as well as other members of the Faculty Council. Through his words and actions, he has repeatedly demonstrated the qualities of a servant leader. He is attentive to the personal and professional well-being of his staff and students, and he's always open to input and responsive to ideas about how to enhance UCCS's contributions to the university and the state. I look forward to continuing to work with him in the next phase of his career. And actually, Dr. Kaufman is on Zoom right now. So, and in addition to Provost Newman's name scholarship and your name, there are also some gifts. And so if current UCCS staff could come up and kind of help present those to Dr. Kravitz, that'd be fantastic. And so for those of you guys who are on Zoom, so we did have a watercolor done of the Capitol that we're giving to him, as well as a gift card on behalf of the center. And actually, thank you, Vice Provost Haynes, for this idea. It is actually the pictures of every cohort that has come through that Richard has been director of. And so kind of was teary-eyed when we're putting this together, because that's a lot of students that have been impacted over 10 years. And we greatly appreciate your leadership for almost 11 years now, and it's been just a fantastic time, and you will definitely be missed here at UC Center Sacramento. And you can watch us from afar, but also join us in person too. So, all right, thank you.
Yeah, well, you've been listening to me for the last hour. I don't know how much more you really need to hear. These kind of things are always really bittersweet. I feel it's a great time to pass the baton of leadership on to someone new, but it's with a lot of mixed feelings that as I tried to express in my formal remarks, that I take leave of so many wonderful people, at least in such a in terms of our formal relationship, both internal and external. Extremely internal, as with the center staff, somewhat internal with other UC Davis and UC affiliated administrators and scholars of one sort or another, and external in terms of the broader policy community and the community at large. And of course, the reason this program was constructed in the first place, to the students at UCCS who have made the experience over the last 10 years so special. So thank you very much.
And that concludes our formal program, and we are actually going to have a reception outside, and it should be ready for everyone now. So thank you, everyone, for joining.